You're listening to Conversation Balloons, interviews with experts and friends about how the generations can help each other thrive. I'm your host, Leah Farish. Check out this episode. Today we have in our little studio one of the world's authorities on urban planning, and Jeff Speck, trained as an architect and then collaborated for 10 years in Miami with new urbanists Andres Duany and Elizabeth Plater-Zyberk. Out of that partnership came the best-selling book Suburban Nation, which targeted sprawl, which we'll be talking about today. He was appointed to the National Endowment for the Arts as design director, where he served for 4 years, and started Speck and Associates, now based in Brookline, Massachusetts. He wrote Walkable City in 2012, and the 10th anniversary edition is in my hands, already dog-eared and heavily marked.
Wonderful.
Jeff Speck's TED Talks have been heard over 5 million times. I think I account for 500,000 of those. I heard his interview with Ken Myers in 2000 and bought a copy of that interview, which I played for my sociology classes back in the day, because I was dazzled by his intellect combined with his self-deprecating humor and realism. Jeff obviously has the eye of an artist, the brain of an engineer, and the heart of a very warm human being. And we're so honored to have you on today, Jeff.
Well, I'm blushing, but thank you. Happy to be here.
We want to talk with you today about how walkable cities are important for each of the stages of life and what challenges they bring to making a city walkable. So I want to start out, if I may, with talking about children in urban areas. You have two, correct?
I do. I have to talk about children, and I have 2 children.
You note that 50% of kids walked to school in the 1960s, the ultimate useful walk, right? And less than 15% of them do now. How is that impacting children, would you say?
So right now, for example, I'm working on a neighborhood in Carmel, Indiana, which is an office park, a giant office park that we're turning into a mixed-use neighborhood. But Suburban Nation very much addressed that, the creation of new places, and the observation about all the people whose quality of life were degraded by living in a sprawl environment. And probably foremost among them were the children. Of course, we would march through the generations, and perhaps you and I will today, and describe the impacts on each generation that come from living in a car-dependent environment. One of the biggest impacts on adults, of course, is making up for the fact that their children absolutely lose independence well beyond an age at which they should no longer be entirely dependent on their parents, right? So most people who grew up in the 60s, maybe the 70s, I grew up mostly in the 70s or earlier, know what that kind of childhood was like. And the fact that, for me, living in a suburb, but it was a pre-war suburb, it was a non-car dependent suburb in which every family had a car, but no one really depended on it. Not many of them actually depended on their car for every aspect of daily life. We contrast suburbs with each other as much as we contrast them with cities. And sometimes people ask us, what do you have against the suburbs? And actually, it's not a suburban versus city or a town versus city or a village versus hamlet versus metropolis conversation we're having here. It's really how we build at each scale vis-a-vis how we get around and how we organize ourselves, which of course determines how we get around. And in the pre-war suburbs, just like the pre-war cities, many of them still today, the automobile is a optional instrument of freedom. It's not a prosthetic device that you need to live your daily life. And so when I was growing up as a kid, and most generations before me, literally from 2nd or 3rd grade on, I had complete independent mobility around my community, to and from school. I would leave to play and be gone for many hours and not be seen for many hours. I would occasionally get mad at my parents and say, I'm going to run away, and when's dinner? And I'd be back by dinner. But the freedom that my friends and I had in that suburb, I guess you could say, is kind of similar to the freedom of a kid in a completely car light cul-de-sac environment, right? Like they build in many of the new suburbs, except that kid has no access to anything except more of the same. More cul-de-sacs, more similar houses, probably more identical demographic, probably not a great deal of variety of land use or of humans, right? The two tend to occur simultaneously, variety of both. Kids today are not afforded the opportunities for independence that their parents had. And some of that is stranger danger, which, by the way, is no greater than it was back when your generation or mine were children. But the perceptions, of course, are much, much worse about what it's like. And I think, we could talk a long time about how people's perceptions and even their politics have changed as a result of being isolated in homogeneous communities, which is another aspect of sprawl. But kids become dependent on their parents just to do the slightest thing. Again, marching through the generations, parents often, one parent has to give up their job just to take the kids around. Of course, the great irony was that my mom didn't work, and she didn't need to take care of me very much. Nowadays, both parents work, and yet about a full parent is needed to get the kid where they're going most of the day. What we learned during COVID, school performs a warehousing function as much as anything else, because with both parents working and a lack of independence for children, then they need to be put somewhere. But what's really interesting is to see how the generations of the millennials and beyond are driving much less than the prior generations. They want to get their driver's licenses less. They're getting them later. Fewer of them are getting driver's licenses. And I'd always wondered, why is it that this generation that grew up driving much more in much more car-dependent environments is more reluctant to drive than a generation like mine that drove less? And I realized, I think they're just sick of being stuck in the car. Like they've spent their whole lives stuck in the back of the car. And for them, I think the car is seen as a bit of a prison. They perhaps realize the places and the times where they've had the most fun and the most freedom were places that weren't car dependent, and they want to live that life. There's the town that my mentors Andres Duany and Elizabeth Plater-Zyberk created that was called Seaside, that kicked off the whole new urbanist movement as a place where you could live, work, shop, recreate, and do everything in one place, even though it was a resort. Children absolutely love it there because it's a whole town with a variety of uses, but the children are completely free. In fact, my friend's nephew, who was a kid, we asked him, he had been to Disneyland and he had been to Seaside, and we said, which did you like more? And he said, I like Seaside more because I had total freedom. In so many words, as a kid.
I think of humanity as a species that needs to reproduce, and to reproduce, you have to have a habitat. You have to have a place where the young can circulate around, learn skills, find a mate, be free, relatively free of predators, not overwhelmed by predators, not overwhelmed by pollutants or other environmental threats. And when I look at how we're doing at providing habitat for young humans, I think we get about a D+.
Well, we're also tremendously mobile, and the scientists tell us, biologists tell us that tremendous mobility in a species is also a sign of great distress. So, it's all there.
I notice you talk about how children who walk to school seem to have a lower incidence of ADHD and obesity. These are serious, impacts on kids as a result of not being able to walk.
Yeah, I think, my kid, let me just say, backing up, I live in Brookline, Massachusetts because I made the choice, looking at the whole Boston area, which I grew up in, but then moved away from, moving back with my family. It was really important for my wife and I to move with our kids to a place where our kids would be walking to school. And our kids will never see the inside of a school bus except to go to like a sports event or something like that. My kids walk to elementary and middle school. They're walking to high school. A lot of the kids in my community do that because it's a dense pre-war, mixed use, largely residential, but not just residential community. It's a suburb of Boston. It happens to be surrounded by Boston on three sides. So it's very urban. The train's right out the window. It was so important to us to give our kids that degree of independence and self-mobility. But I think that, what's fascinating is we came from DC and we left DC because the school situation wasn't working for us. And the reason why it wasn't working for us was we had three choices. And this points a bit to equity issues as well. We could live in the neighborhood we lived in and go to the local school, which was no good because schools are a function of the wealth of their neighborhoods. And, that's an unfortunate fact in the US that isn't the fact in many other countries, that the quality of a school is a function of the wealth of your neighborhood. We could have moved expensively to to upper Northwest in DC, where the schools are quite good, but it would have been a much more suburban lifestyle, and we would have been eating and shopping and dining at chain establishments, which is not a way that we wanted to live our lives. Or we could do what we had been doing for the past few years, which was to be in this charter school system. And half of the public schools in DC are charter schools. It's the great experiment. And what that great experiment has accomplished in DC is that we now have double the commute, because the parents are commuting across town. Because as the parents are commuting across town to get to their jobs, one parent and a child are driving across town at the exact same time to get to school. And there's this tremendous traffic as a result of this double commute happening. The afternoon's a little more spread out, right? Because school gets out before work does. But my wife, because it fell to her, was spending a good 6 or 7 hours a week just getting my kids to or from school. And that was time that would have been so much better spent other ways. And another thing is community does not form around charter schools in the same way it forms around neighborhood schools. So I have another book that you didn't mention that's called Walkable City Rules. And Walkable City Rules was the follow-up to Walkable City that's much more for practitioners. So if you're listening to this and you are in the business of making place or advocating, perhaps as a community activist, for better places, and you want to understand the details and the numbers with lots of images and charts and diagrams, Walkable City Rules is 101 Steps to Making Better Places. That's the subtitle. One of the steps is to question charter schools. And actually, it says, the charter school experiment has had a variety of outcomes. It hasn't improved equity. It hasn't improved racial desegregation. And citywide, it really hasn't improved student performance. One thing it's really done is worsen commutes, and it's disassociated parents from the school community. Because, the way that a lot of community forms, if you're a parent, is that you're meeting other parents on the playground. You're meeting them as you pick up your kids. You're meeting them, particularly if you're not just driving to pick up your kids. But when our kid went to our neighborhood school in DC, we walked to the school and picked them up, and we met all the other parents who were walking to school. And then a parent says, "Hey, can we hang around today and clean up the field?" Or then, "Hey, it's walk to school week. Can we get together and create some advocacy for making the streets safer around the school?" And all these things happen. And your best friend group ends up being the co-parents in your school who live in your neighborhood. So you walk to their house for dinner, you walk to their house for drinks, you meet at the cafe to hang out. Well, none of that happens in charter schools. You may get to know the parents, you may commute to hang out with them, but there's much less community formation because that's not happening across the distances that you're presented with. And when it does happen, of course, it's incredibly inefficient because everyone's driving everywhere to meet these parents who live far away. So I didn't intend to go there, but I think charter schools are a real problem. And don't. So I believe the name of the rule was, plan for neighborhood schools, small schools, which we know perform better within walking distance of houses, are how communities form.
And homeschooling has a very small carbon footprint, and
That's
co-op
true.
schooling that creates its own community often is neighborhood oriented and gives kids a lot of agency. And there are other alternatives to magnet schools and things like that. And I'm glad you're alert to those. I also think about large families in urban areas and walkable neighborhoods. And I look at the cover of your book here, and everyone's walking alone, which works very well. Walkable neighborhoods seem to lend themselves to individual pedestrians, but it's hard for me to imagine um, leading a half a dozen children through the metro system or the various other the transit systems that would be required in walkable neighborhoods. Even walking from one place to another with a large family seems really difficult. And I wonder if that's why we don't see many large families in urban areas.
Well, I do think the number one reason we don't see large families or families as much in urban areas is because of school quality. It's that simple. Parents absolutely want the best school for their kids. A lot of them will tell you they want to have a yard, but that's less important. If your community provides good playgrounds and open spaces like ours does, we don't have a yard. We live in an apartment, and it's a delightful quality of life. But the school, parents will not stay in a neighborhood unless they're sending their kids to some private school or something else. Parents or homeschooling, parents will not stay in a neighborhood that doesn't have good schools when they can move to a neighborhood with better schools. And that's what the suburbs, in an inequitable way, offer our children. Interesting comment about the cover of the book. I think it was just a graphic choice with the artists scattering the people around as individuals. But my 11-year-old, now he's 12, but when he was 11, he would ride the streetcar by himself, right? So certainly, I think in a good situation, you can send your kid on transit at for example, a junior high school age. But I have lots of nice pictures of families walking around cities. Most of them are tourists.
Yeah. I do hate to think of getting all the groceries and supplies and diapers into a fourth floor walk up with 6 kids in tow. And I don't know how you provision a home like that, but
we have a 3.5 floor walk up because there's a big stoop and then we're on the 3rd floor. And, my legs are pretty strong because I'm always walking the groceries up the steps. But also, the European, the French model of shopping a little bit every day, right? Putting it in the bike basket or carrying it with you is so much more convivial than the massive supermarket trip once a week. But I have to say that I've got friends who have cargo bikes, and they're using them like SUVs and doing a massive amount of transport, including moving apartments on these cargo bikes.
Why is it so hard to get fresh produce for our families in urban neighborhoods?
Well, of course, a lot of it is food deserts surrounding places of lower income. So the supermarket chains have very strict criteria that allows them to determine where to put a store. And a big part of it is population number, but also a big part of it is demographic. So, lower income neighborhoods have historically struggled with a lack of supply. And governments understand that it's perhaps necessary to mess up, to shake up the model a little bit with subsidies and other things. But it's very rare when subsidized retail succeeds or lasts for a long time. So it's very much a challenge. Of course, one surprising solution to food deserts is gentrification, but that has its own negative consequences. And by the way, I don't talk about gentrification. I talk about displacement, which is kind of a more operational term, instrumental term, and the efforts that cities have made, do make to stem gentrification can be quite effective. But many cities just don't care. Like many cities' leadership don't make the effort to coordinate planning with anti-gentrification measures or anti-displacement measures because they actually doesn't matter to them. But you
more
really
revenue, more tax revenue for the city anyway.
So as a planner, personally, as a city planner, I make it my point to raise these issues. You have to hold the municipalities' feet to the fire and say, hey, actually, it took me a long time to realize this. It took me 20 years as a planner to realize that it's my job to make places more expensive. And that's a weird way to describe it. I would never say that's my intention. But, it's my job to make places better. And when you make them better, when the traffic is less threatening, when there's less crime, when there's more residents and a greater mix of residents, prices go up. And as a planner, we have two choices. You can stop making places better, which is not in the job description, or you can work with cities and identify, housing trust funds and renter into owner programs and tax abatements and other tools that cities effectively use to stem displacement and ask the city to implement those simultaneously with the work that you're doing.
Right. So with the scourge of COVID, I think a lot of people fled the city thinking that mass transit was a big super spreader. And even when I think of traveling with small children, I think of the 3-word mantra as we go through all the forms of transit: don't touch that, don't touch that.
Right. That was even before COVID.
I just can't see daily shepherding little kids through things that 40,000 other people have touched that day. I'd rather put them in a car.
So there were two great myths that arose around COVID that I don't think have yet been what's the word? Expelled? Dispelled. There were two myths that rose around COVID that I do not think have yet been dispelled. One was that you're safer in a suburban or rural area. And the data on that are very clear because, and I have in my book, the comprehensive large studies were done. And they found that your chance of catching COVID in a rural area or a suburban area or an urban area were pretty much identical. But your chance of surviving COVID were much higher in an urban area, or I should say statistically significantly higher in an urban area. And people say, oh, that's a function of better hospitals, or it's a function of better wealth, right? Wealthier places do better. But they zeroed all that out. And actually, what the epidemiologists concluded was that living in cities made people fundamentally healthier, particularly less obese, which protected them against COVID. And the main message, it was almost like I wrote the script. The main message was, in urban areas, people walk more, and people who walk more are healthier and survive COVID at higher rates. So to get people to leave the city where they walk for a suburban or rural area where they don't would be a huge negative for our national health. That was the first myth, and that was interesting to learn. The second was, you may be aware that car crash fatalities went up by an eighth, by 12% during COVID. By the way, in much of the world, they went down, dropped significantly. But the mythology that you read articles about in the U.S. was that people were just insane, that they were just screaming, COVID, and flooring the car, unhitching their seatbelts and piling into whatever was in front of them. In fact, what was discovered that most people don't know is that it was simply the drop in congestion on our highways. So congestion saves lives. Now, you may not enjoy being in congestion, but in our highways and in many of our higher speed local streets, without congestion, people are driving more dangerously. So congestion dropped by a quarter, and deaths went up by an eighth. And I like to remember that because highway departments, when they advocate for widening roads, they tell you that the three reasons to do it are to to end congestion, to improve air quality, and to improve safety, which are precisely the three things that those road widenings never achieve. Highway widenings are always filled up, usually within four years, with as many new trips as room has been provided, so that congestion is constant. And in fact, congestion is a constant because it's our principal constraint to driving. So when you remove congestion from a congested system, people adjust their behavior and the congestion automatically comes back, because that's the reason why they weren't driving at rush hour, weren't driving on peak. We're living closer to work, we're carpooling, we're taking transit, et cetera. So the congestion never goes away. Of course, the air quality gets worse because it's actually cars moving. They're worse than cars idling in terms of contributing to pollution. So and in fact, 80% of the pollution from a car, I should say 80% of the particulate matter that comes from a car comes from the brakes and the tires, not from the exhaust pipe. So electric cars don't help. And, when you're stuck in traffic and you see the air wavering from the heat of all the exhaust pipes, you think, oh my God, what a horrible thing for the environment. But actually, it's cars moving fast that pollute much more. And then finally, highway departments tell you that if they remove this, tight spot on a road, people will drive more safely. In fact, what happens is people speed up. And so when you limit congestion or when you widen a road in other ways to make driving smoother, you're actually causing more deaths. So whenever a highway department says we're going to widen this street to improve safety, I will remind them that when congestion dropped in COVID by 25%, deaths went up by half that.
Mm-hmm. In talking about young adults and walkable cities, you note that in walkable city rules, you said that 64% of millennials choose first where they want to live and then look for work. 77% say they plan to live in an urban core. 42% of baby boomers want to live in a place that doesn't need cars for daily life, and 63% of millennials want to live in a place like that. In your update, you do find that millennials do tend to move to the suburbs a little bit more than predicted because of schools, which we've already talked about. But,
what happened was that young people didn't stop liking cities, but millennials stopped being young people. so the front edge millennials, I think, are now 37. So if they've had most of them have had their kids, right? So the prediction is still true in terms of what younger people want. But as I suggested, millennials were basing their location primarily on school choice. In terms of younger people, I will say, probably, although this certainly doesn't stop, and I have friends my age who suffer from this condition, but drinking and driving is a huge portion of our car crash deaths. The 42,000 Americans who die every year in car crashes, a ton of those are alcohol related, and the biggest indication,
or drug related. And we're getting much more marijuana in the population.
People think if they're not drinking, they can drive, but of course, any drug that alters your perception is going to be an issue. But the great cost that's presented to us by cities, typical, let's just say metropolitan areas, in which, let's just face it, if you're going to the bar, you're driving. The concept of the roadhouse is, in many places, the standard way to drive. Designated drivers are not named. That was a cute idea from the 80s. It doesn't happen very much. Everyone's drinking and driving. Everyone says, "Oh, I can drive on 2 drinks." Well, if I can drive on 2, I can drive on 3. My wife was in an event the other day where she saw a guy have six straight vodkas and then drive home. This is normal in our society, and particularly among younger people. And the best thing we can do is to stop that from happening. And that's the good thing about Uber and Lyft. That's an amazing contribution that Uber and Lyft have made to our avoiding our death toll in vehicles. I have to say that it didn't make much of a difference, apparently. Well, or I wonder what the death toll would have been during COVID if Uber and Lyft hadn't been around. But I guess maybe people weren't taking Uber and Lyft during the peak of COVID, right? I do want to point out that Uber and Lyft have their own problems, and we could talk about that at length, and I do in Walkable City. Talk about, for example, how every Uber trip basically triples the amount of miles that are driven, and
because they have to deadhead to get a new customer.
Well, they have to deadhead, but also fully 45% of the trips they take are people who otherwise would have carpooled or taken transit or walked or biked or not gone at all. So you add the deadheading, you multiply the deadheading by the percentage of people who wouldn't have driven, and you end up with it 3 to 4 times the number of miles for every mile driven. So that's a real problem for congestion. It's a problem for climate. Uber has done nothing to reduce driving, as was the intentional. The original intention has done nothing to help with the climate. It's only worsened the climate. But I wanted to point out that drinking and driving is a huge problem. It's a huge component of our death rate, and one way to demonstrate that is to look at Utah, because most Mormons don't drink or don't drink much, and the one state that beats the odds in terms of dependence on automobiles, which Utah is tremendously dependent on, and car crash deaths is Utah. It's like, normally the two graphs chart side by side, auto dependence and death by driving. Utah is the outlier because of Mormonism. So that just tells you what a factor alcohol is in driving.
Yeah. Well, I notice you talk about how many more households now are childless. In 1970, almost half of the households had children. Now 88% of households are childless. And in DC, the number of kids has dropped 20% in 10 years. So it may be that the practical aspects of walkable cities are, favor this trend, because we don't need to factor in children as much as we used to.
Well, I think that's a separate point. And by the way, that data that you're very kindly reading from Walkable City is now 11 years old. I do believe that DC is now has significantly more children than it did a decade ago. But I do make the point that a lot of cities and a lot of downtowns, particularly in cities that are a little bit, rougher around the edges, the people who are moving into those downtowns first are not families. They're singles, and they are typically younger singles who then make it safe for their parents' generation. The third generation that arrives in cities is families, and often it's just the younger generation growing up, as opposed to families moving into cities as families.
You talk about in talking about adults, the working years. These are the people that are paying for all the things that we're talking about, improvements or troublesome settings. And you talk about how it's unfair for non-car owners to pay for parking, road maintenance, policing, the public cost of car crashes, and all of these things if they don't use cars. But aren't car owners also having to pay for things they don't use, with large costs of public transportation, administration, tax incentives, all of that?
Well, I think if you look at the amount that our society subsidizes automobile use versus transit use, both in percentage per trip, but also just in real numbers, like our transit budgets are way smaller than our road building and highway budgets. You find that it's really a vast discrepancy. We need to remember that, for like 80 years, we've had government programs essentially subsidizing sprawl. We've had giant highway spending programs. We've of course had the home mortgage loan interest deduction, which was the biggest tool for suburbanization you could have imagined. By the way, in Canada, the federal government spent 10 cents on every dollar for a inner city highway expansion, whereas in the U.S. it was 90 cents on every dollar. So you can see why so many states and cities made the choice to expand their roads in the U.S. But the huge amount of subsidies, both in encouraging single-family home ownership, which, by the way, for so much of that time, for basically from after World War II until about the 70s, that was only available to white families because of redlining and other factors. So there was a huge redistribution of income as well that happened there. But I'm sorry that I'm not more of a historian who can appropriately scoff at your well-intentioned question, because the amount of subsidy that has been thrown at our both our driving infrastructure, but our suburbanization as a country has been astronomical, trillions of dollars. Now, I know that in terms of individual trips, if you pay $1 to take transit, the chances are that your city or metropolitan area is subsidizing that to the tune of about $1. If you pay $1 to drive, then it's being subsidized. Last study I saw, about $9. So there's much higher subsidies around driving a vehicle. Now, of course, there's all the externalities as too, and I think that's an important thing to point out, which is that people say, why do we bother building transit? Because if we move people off the congested roads and new people take their place, then you're not reducing congestion by building transit. But what you're doing actually is you're moving people from a transport mode that has tremendous negative externalities to a transport mode that has many fewer negative externalities. So in terms of climate change and the environment, in terms of death and destruction, in terms of obesity and health criteria, getting someone to switch from driving to transit has all these positive outcomes that haven't been taken into account when we as a nation decided what modes of transportation to subsidize the most.
I kind of blame the Protestant Reformation on Sprawl a little bit, because until then, one village, one church.
And that made it easier, didn't it? It's like neighborhood-based schools.
Yeah. And now I know that people feel like they need to find exactly the stripe of church that appeals to them, and they will drive 30 minutes to go to a church like that, maybe twice a week. And I wanted to, a friend of mine who's a city planner, I said, I'm going to get to talk to Jeff Speck. Do you have any questions that you would like asked? And he said, how can churches help areas that aren't walkable become better spaces for community?
Well, I'd first back up and say that the church commuting that you describe is very much real. Interestingly, when you live in a dense enough area, you still don't have to go very far to your stripe of church or temple. Here in Brookline, there are dozens of churches and temples, or even a mosque, walkable from here. Dozens. There's also, of course, transit that takes you to so many more when you're in a transit-served area. So, in transit-served areas or in quite dense areas, having a wonderful rainbow of ecclesiastical choice does not necessarily contribute to driving or sprawl. Otherwise, I think the question isn't, okay, I've never thought about this question, so it's going to be a rambling and perhaps not helpful response. My first response is that, we need community so much more in places that are auto-oriented and sprawling, that the main thing a church can do to build community in those environments is to exist. So I think the first lesson is that we need more third places, be they cafes or bars or churches, places where people come together not to work and not to be at home. You may be aware of a book by Robert Putnam called Bowling Alone that came out about the year 2000, if I'm not mistaken. And he looked at this, easy to document decline in public-oriented activity, social activity, over the past decades, and looked for causes. And he didn't have a dog in the fight, and he certainly had many causes that he was able to identify, but he found no stronger correlation in his study than the inverse correlation between length of commute and participation in social activity. So the number one thing we've done is tie ourselves to these long commutes. There was a more recent study that is cited in my update to Walkable City, where a sociologist at a university that I forgot but wrote down found that there's no greater determination of how much community activity a person does than the degree to which they use active modes of transportation. In other words, the degree to which they don't drive. So again, it's kind of the inverse study, showing that the people who do the most for their community are the ones who aren't in cars, which I thought was logical, but yet wonderful to read. Kind of, perhaps obvious, but you want to have the data, and now we have the data. But otherwise, I think what can churches do to reduce people's dependency on driving? I haven't thought about that, and I don't know if there is much churches can do, except in the most mundane and simple way to encourage carpooling among their parishioners and do outreach events in the community. But I'm not sure what else I could offer there.
You talk about inclusionary zoning, and I've, as an attorney, I've represented some churches that were excluded from a new space in downtown because the city knew they would be tax exempt and begrudged them the property in those choice locations. So sometimes it can be hard for churches to locate in dense areas, but they do tend to be active on Sunday mornings and some weeknight evenings, which are less busy in terms of traffic and occupancy, and can actually help with the vibrancy of the streets that you have observed is so important.
Well, I actually do have, now that I've thought about it a second, I do have some advice for churches based on the frustration I've had with churches, which is that they often take up very large portions of a city for their parking, which is only full, Sunday morning, or maybe some other time of the week, and the rest of the time it goes unused and wasted. And this is a very much a big picture discussion, because most churches won't have this choice. But if you're looking to locate a church somewhere, there's no better place to put it than near office buildings. Because if you're in a part of the city with a lot of office, there's going to be a lot of parking lots that are empty precisely when you want them to be empty, and that can use your parking when you're not there. So that's a very big picture planning conversation. But putting churches where offices are is a great idea.
Have you ever entertained a notion of helping with a nursing shortage or teacher shortage or police shortage by offering housing near those work areas?
Well, we advocate for it all the time. I'm not a housing specialist. I'm really looking much more at the grand design of neighborhoods. We've done many plans that specifically locate attainable housing in those places where we need the people to be. However, getting communities to then find the subsidies and the programs that are going to pay for that to happen are always quite challenging.
Well, let's take the last 5 minutes here talking about the elderly and maybe disabilities. The difficulties of operating in a walkable neighborhood when you can't walk well. A lot of people don't.
First, I did want to talk about this, and I wrote an article for AARP once about trying to advocate that older people, before they pick their next move, think very carefully about what happens when they lose their driver's licenses. Because, there used to be a time in America when we didn't even have retirement homes. And it wasn't that long ago. And there are a number of changes that led to the fact that so many old people are warehoused in institutions right now. But probably the biggest one was the fact that old people used to be able to serve their own needs without driving much more effectively. And we now have a society in which when the old person loses those car keys, they become dependent. They're no longer self-reliant. And as my mentor, Andres Duany, used to say, you can daughter for much longer than you can drive. And he's well into his 70s now, so maybe he's thinking about that from a personal perspective. But the idea that you live in this place where there's a bus that comes every Tuesday to take you to the mall, and that's the only freedom that you have, is a far cry from what most elderly people used to experience. And moreover, what's available in a number of places that sociologists about maybe 25 years ago, they identified this thing called the NORC, the Naturally Occurring Retirement Community. And I believe the first one that was identified was the Upper East Side of Manhattan. And it's basically a place where a bunch of old people decide to live because they realize they can have delightful, liberated, independent lives, living alone or with a roommate, whatever, but not in an institution as they get older. So I don't think that anyone's been punished more than the elderly when it comes to the fact that so little of our environment now offers that ability to satisfy your own daily needs without driving. In terms of the handicap, there's this kind of mythology that people who have trouble walking are better off driving. In fact, the handicapped, many of them, many more handicapped people can't drive than can't get around on their own when provided with the right tool, be it a wheelchair, motorized wheelchair, bicycle. I know some, I don't know them personally, but I've seen in Boston people who use, and even on the train, people who use bikes basically as mobility tools. They can't walk very well, but they can bike, which is fascinating to me. Certainly, I talk about the walkable city, and that sounds like a bit of an ableist term. I have to be a little careful and acknowledge, and I'm glad that you've given me the opportunity, anything you do to make a city better for walking makes it better for rolling. But more to the point, anything you do to make a city better for rolling makes it better for walking and for everybody. And the ADA was great. The Americans with Disabilities Act was great for wheelchairs, but it's even better for baby carriages. Right? There's so many ways that making a more making an environment that's welcoming to everyone helps everyone, and not just those people who might need it. There's not a category of human that is better served by a driving community than a walking community. And the sooner that's not only acknowledged but shouted on every street corner, the more progress we'll see.
Well, thank you so much for being with us today. We are honored to have you. And where would you like people to go to get in touch with you, Jeff?
Well, actually, I have a website that's my name, jeffspeck.com, jeffspec.com. That's both for my firm and for my books, etc. I would love it, as you know, if people would pick up the new edition, 10th anniversary edition of Walkable City. It's the book that was written for everyone. It's the book that was written to start the conversation around walkability in American communities. It's been the best-selling book of that type for the last decade. And the new 10th anniversary edition has 100 new pages on recent events that I just wrote, has a new introduction, and I hope people will check it out.
Thank you to Jeff. Thank you to my producer, Caleb, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye. Thanks for listening to Conversation Balloons. Look for more episodes and information at leahfarish.com. That's LEAHFARISH.com. And follow me on Facebook and Instagram.